The last session actually is about regulation, and we talked about that earlier at lunchtime. It came out with the technology index and the effect that regulation has. Some people think my instinct, incidentally, on the exchanges we had about regulation at lunchtime, and for the benefit of our panelists, we had some feedback with a number of people in the technology sector that we interviewed saying that regulation is a potential hindrance to them developing their businesses, and yet a number of people answering different questions the other way that gave the impression that maybe ultimately it didn't affect where they chose to base their businesses. And my hunch was that a lot of people in the technology sector think that and believe that regulation can be a hindrance, but ultimately it doesn't stop them doing what they really want to do. That is my guess, but we'll find out what our panel members think. To introduce the panel and to moderate, it's my pleasure to welcome Lord Tim Clement Jones. Tim, as I just call him, I'm allowed to call him that. If I called him Lord, he'd probably hit me. I don't know. Tim, maybe familiar, I think, to a number of you. He's our international business relations partner and our London office managing partner. Tim is a qualified lawyer. He was actually formerly in-house. He was Group Company Secretary and Legal Advisor to Kingfisher. He had senior legal positions at Grand Metropolitan and LWT, London Weekend Television, and is also well known, I'm sure, to a lot of you as a leading member of the Liberal Democrat Party. He has been chairman. He has been in the past a spokesman on health and culture, media and sport. And so I'll hand over to you, Tim, to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for reminding me of my nefarious past, because I'm going to be doing that exactly with our panel members now. Anyway, a very, very warm welcome to this session, which is really perhaps the most reflective part of the proceedings today, in terms of looking at the shape of policy and regulation in Europe and in individual European markets. And in their own way, each of our panel members today has a lot of experience in terms of influencing policy, shaping policy towards technology in all its forms in Europe and in individual European countries. I'm going to start on my left with Patrick Van Eck, and then go through Lord George Robertson and then Francesco Ko, and I'll just describe them and give a little bit of background for each of them before we start our panel session. Patrick Van Eck, and I should say Professor Patrick Van Eck, is a partner in the IP&T group of DLA Piper in Brussels. He's extensively involved in various research and consulting projects for the European Commission and several national governments. And he in particular focuses on internet law, data protection, e-commerce and e-government, and he co-chairs our international e-business practice group. He's a professor at the University of Antwerp, teaching internet law, and he is a visiting professor at Queen Mary University of London. So that's Patrick. And then moving on to Lord George Robertson. Lord George Robertson, as you can tell from his prefix, is a colleague of mine in the House of Lords, but he has a completely different set of experience. He was an MP for 20 years. In the Blair government, he was the very first Secretary of State for Defence. And then he was invited to become the 10th Secretary General of NATO, which he performed in an extremely distinguished fashion. He is now a consultant to the Cohen Group, which is very closely linked to DLA Piper, one of our strategic partners. And in addition to that, he was Vice Deputy Chairman of Cable and Wireless, and a number of other appointments since he stepped down from being Secretary General of NATO. Our third panelist is Francesco Ko. He has a background in electronics engineering, He's had a succession of very high-profile jobs in that sector. He started off with Olivetti and McKinsey. He then went on to be managing director of Omnitel Pronto, the first private operator in mobile phones in Italy. He then moved to Meloni Elettrodomestici, which later became Indesit. He was then managing director of Cable and Wireless, and in fact he coincided with George when he was there. Later he became chairman of the European Advisory Board of Lehman Brothers, and then deputy chairman of Investment Banking Europe in Nomura. He's now the CEO of Avio, the leader in the aerospace sector in Italy. And during his time at Nomura in particular, Francesco really produced the definitive study of broadband rollout in the UK. So as David Bimbleby would say, here is your panel. Now, I'm going to ask each of them in turn just to set the scene in terms of their own particular interests and where they think that policy and regulation is going. And then I'm going to open out the proceedings, ask them, interrogate them a little bit about some of the points they've made. And after about half an hour or so, we'll open it up to the audience more broadly. And I very much hope that you'll be able to participate and join in the debate with us. So I'm going to ask Francesco Ko, first of all, to say a few words, then George Robertson, and then Patrick Van Eck. Francesco.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for having me here. It is very clear to me, I have attended part of the panel discussion before, that the audience has a high degree of literacy in this matter. So rather than deep dive into the specifics of technology, maybe sharing a couple of observations based on my recent work and the interaction with governments, because I actually did both the same study, both in Italy and the UK with the government when it comes to broadband. I think the overall picture that, from my perspective, some thought is we are, in my view, in Europe as in the rest of the world, entering a phase of fundamental renewal of the notion of the enterprise and the business. I think most of the traditional way of thinking about businesses, innovation, has in a way rooted into a Victorian model of a fairly static view of the world. And I think most of the technologies we've talked about today tend to point to a fundamentally lowering of the entry level and the barriers to entry for developing innovation. There is, in my view, a democratization process going on, where a combination of the internet, but in general, the microelectronics, nanotechnologies, biotech, allow for innovation to really start in a very democratic bottom-up way. And I think if I have to kind of point to a couple of thoughts is, when it comes to Europe, the risk being squashed in between a US Silicon Valley or general innovation where the intellectual property continues to be a driver, and the strength and muscles of high level of resources, low cost markets of China is high. And how do we take advantage of the potential coming from this new way of thinking about innovation in this context? And I think couple of thoughts. First, I've observed that in boards, in leadership, in political leadership as well, the level of literacy, the level of understanding, might sound a bit illuministic here, is still relatively low. Understanding what innovation and how innovation should be applied is not, in my view, entirely clear. There is always a tendency of moving into, how much money allocate to this and the other, rather than rethinking some of the fundamental values with which we'll think of policy making. And to be more specific, a second point is a very difficult balance between protecting incumbency and favoring the attacker or the challenger. And I observed both in this country and in Italy, and frankly in Italy much more so than in this country, the dilemma and the tendency always to move to the protection of the past. Maybe it's because demographics, maybe because the high level of savings, maybe because lack of understanding or trust in what a future can bring. And I think there is a time, probably an opportunity to reflect, and these events are welcome because, in a way, help shaping the thought process and the interaction that each of you has with governments and policy making can help, is how do we, Europeans, drive a new balance between past and future? I think I'm now in a job where innovation is the name of the game. We're literally about to launch a new satellite launcher next Monday. And one of the issues is that when you go for this type of innovation, as for instance, you've got to factor in a relatively healthy level of failure. And the way in which leadership, politicians, and businesses and boards think about failure in Europe is very different from the way they think about failure in other parts of the world. So I'll stop here in terms of introduction, but the big themes of a new way of being a business, the fragmentation and the lower scale, the opportunity for many people to contribute to innovation, particularly youngsters, the reaction or the shaping of the policy making to strike the right balance between incumbency and challenges, and the nurturing of some cultural values that favor risk-taking are probably some of the themes that I see as Europe being an interesting, potentially very promising ground for growth, because actually talents in Europe are still abundant when it comes to this type of technologies.
Thank you, Francesco. George.
Thanks, Tim. During the economic crisis in Russia under Boris Yeltsin, he was asked by a young female reporter one day if he could sum up the current economic situation in his country in just one word. So he thought for a moment and he looked at her and he said, "Good." She said, "Oh, Mr. President," she said, "that's very, very interesting." He said, "What if you had two words?" And he looked at her and he said, "Not good." And if you're looking at the situation in Europe today, that's the answer as well. The not good is front page, high profile, and almost insoluble. We're struggling, staggering, hopefully, towards some form of solution to what is a potentially cataclysmic disaster for the Eurozone and for the countries in it. I don't think that political leadership in this country and in other countries has sufficiently illustrated to people just how bad things are. People don't notice it yet, and really they think it's pretty remote what's happening to Greece and how that might affect them. But of course the interconnections between the banking systems in all of these countries and indeed globally mean that a default by one country, and maybe even more countries, would really be catastrophic. And therefore we stagger towards hopefully a solution, but nobody at the moment can actually define what that solution is actually going to be. And it may well be determined by extraneous factors that we haven't yet really fully realized are happening. So that's the bad side. But remarkably, despite all of that, there is a good side as well. And there is a drive towards innovation. The European Union, as distinct from the Eurozone, is still driving ahead with the critical mass to be competitive in the world. And as Francesco has said, there is an abundance of talent in the European countries. Towards the East and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, as I know, there is huge educated talent there available to be tapped into. I'm the deputy chairman of TNK-BP, which is BP's joint venture with the Russians. So I've got first-hand experience of seeing the amazing amount of talent that exists in Russia, which has been suppressed for so long, but which has now got an opportunity with the right management and with the right incentives to come to the fore. The European Union has a number of programs, the Innovation Union being the biggest one, which seeks to try to create the conditions for innovation, the conditions whereby the public and the private sector might combine together to make sure that we can compete with the sort of headline countries like China and Brazil and India, which sometimes mesmerize us and occasionally block our thinking as to what the opportunities are within our own continent as well. And I think that the European Union goes on with these initiatives, even although they could be prejudiced by the macroeconomic crisis that envelops all of the thinking at the present moment. But it is interesting, actually, if you leave the macro side for a moment and look at the micro, the crisis of 2008 has not yet played itself out. The credit crunch and all that went on with that has had a deep and a penetrating effect, and some countries are going to be hit the double whammy of getting the new crisis on top of the old crisis. But one country that not only survived the 2008 crisis and actually came out of it smiling is Estonia. Tiny little country in the Baltic states, massively over-leveraged in the banks with currencies outside of their own, in dire trouble with its balance of trade and with its internal deficit, but which has managed to turn itself round, largely by focusing on its people, on its talents, and on innovation itself. The number of new companies that have been created in Estonia in the last few years is quite remarkable. I can't offhand remember all of the statistics, but I looked at it a couple of weeks ago, and it is an astonishing turnaround that has taken place. They suppressed internal demand, that's true, focused on exports and turned round the trade imbalance that they had, and are now driving ahead. Now, it's difficult to make generalizations about one small country, especially since the neighboring Baltic states were not nearly so successful in getting through that crisis of 2008. And yet, there are lessons. The innovation, the nurturing of talent, the investment in the university spheres, the way in which they treated small and medium-sized businesses, and that perhaps is where the future is going to be. The Commissioner for Industry and Entrepreneurship in the European Commission, Antonia Tajani, was saying it's easier to believe that we can create 23 million new jobs if our 23 million SMEs each employ just one more person than to expect 3,800 new jobs to be created by each of our 6,000 blue chips. And maybe at this stage in the economic cycle, at this stage in where we are in the world today, we really need to look at programs that are going to encourage risk-taking among the banking sector, rather than the frankly idiotic people who were investing in Greece when they all now say they knew it was a basket case, but should actually be looking to back the small entrepreneurs and the small and medium-sized businesses. So, with all the new things that are coming along, the big data and lean manufacturing and all of these other fancy jargon items that I don't fully understand myself, they are coming upon us very, very quickly. And Francesco knows it more than I do, but encouraging the SME sector may well be the answer, if indeed there's an answer at the moment.
Thank you, George. I must say that trips off your tongue, that jargon trips off your tongue extremely well, though. So we may need to unpack this later. Patrick.
Well, Tim, I would like to share with you some gossip from Brussels. On what's happening there behind those anonymous buildings and what are they creating right now. Because it is indeed true that at this very moment, the Commission officials, they are so enthusiastic about technology, so eager about regulating technology that maybe they are suffering from the puppy syndrome. I don't know if you know the puppy syndrome, but maybe some of us know that once as a child you got that puppy and you love it so much that you hug it and you carry it so much that you kill it. The risk exists that the Commission officials or that the European Commission is also going into that direction for different reasons. One of them is that they think, and I think on many occasions it is true, but that they think that by regulating the markets, they could also kickstart a new market and they could actually framework that new reality and find new opportunities for the new technologies-related services. However, quite often, and we have seen some examples in the past, quite often they are too early to regulate. And there have been some initiatives, and I will just give a few examples. There have been some initiatives where instead of actually kickstarting the market has been killed, has died out. Think of, for example, the e-money directive. Just a few years ago, the e-money directive was launched, and just to try to find a legally framed solution for that new kind of issuance of electronic money. It was in those times that we were talking about companies that do not exist any longer, like Cybercash, DigiCash, etc. And the Commission, they wanted to set some minimum quality standards, not as high as the banking, as a traditional bank, but a little bit lower, but still quite high level of quality. Well, those companies that just started beginning these new kind of services, they were not able to meet these requirements. Even worse, some other companies, they actually suddenly realized they were also qualifying as e-money providers. Think of airline operators, or think of telecommunications operators who were, because they were also issuing air miles and because of a bad definition, because not knowing the technology sufficiently well, because of a bad definition of the e-commerce directive, suddenly they realized that they also qualified as an e-money issuer, which had some strange consequences, because an e-money issuer is not allowed to provide any other services than the issuance of electronic money. So suddenly those airline companies and those mobile operators, they said, we have an issue here. That's just one example of being too early to regulate a specific market. Another concern that I see is that the European Commission is sometimes too heavily focusing on consumers, small and medium enterprises, and that when you look at the balance between the well-established industry on the one side and the SMEs and micro companies and the consumers on the other side, that sometimes the balance is a little bit too much going into the direction of consumer protection, which is, I think, a very good example from a European perspective of responsible entrepreneurship. But on the other hand, if we look at it from a global perspective, we may run the risk by applying such stringent rules that we actually end up in a competitive disadvantaged position with our own industry. One example maybe is the very recent draft regulation on data protection, where we are going to have the most stringent legal framework relating to processing of personal data, and it will affect all of us. Whether you're a company, B2B, or whether you are just having employee personal data, whether you're having supplier personal data, we are all going to be affected. And we will have to do these impact assessments. We will have to make sure that that our processes have privacy by default and privacy by design principles in place. So this is an example of policy making that could have an impact on our businesses. And maybe just a last point or a last concern that I have is that when you look at the new legal initiatives, and there are quite a few that are currently being undertaken, the Commission is still looking at a dual reality. On the one hand, the offline world, on the other hand, the online worlds. And so we are setting up a legal framework, a dual legal framework with completely different rules for electronic contracting, electronic invoicing, electronic signatures, and I can continue. But we already heard quite a few times this morning and this afternoon that maybe we, digital immigrants, we are still talking and thinking in two worlds, going online, for example, but the digital natives who are also growing and becoming older, well, they do not think in these terms. And if they are going to go into a contractual arrangement, they never think, is this now an e-contract or is it a paper contract? Although they should, because the rules are different from the kind of medium that you're using. So probably there is also, that is a concern, and there is also work to do there when discussing, when trying to influence the policymakers from that perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. We've now got a real collection of issues which I think we can proceed to unpack somewhat. The whole issue of whether or not we can really look at Europe as a whole, whether the kind of regulation we've got is appropriate, whether it's possible to have programs that really make a great deal of sense across the board, like the Innovation Union, which George mentioned, or whether we are, in a sense, a single market, as Francesco said, squashed between Silicon Valley and the East. And then, of course, we can go on to talk about what is going to be effective. Can we emulate or roll out the sort of experience of Estonia in other markets in Europe? Is that possible? What kind of cultural values do we need to instill currently in our education system and elsewhere? Is there indeed should there be a difference between the way we treat offline and online in so many ways? That's become really a very marked distinction in everyday life as well as in European regulation. And what kind of regulation should we have from Europe? Should we be really deregulating rather than regulating? And are we killing some of these young industries? It is pretty horrifying how little we have in Europe compared to even Africa in terms of the ability to pay electronically by mobile phone, for instance. And are SMEs the future? There are many representatives here of the larger companies. Does our future lie with SMEs in the way that George mentioned? Can they build sufficient scale sufficiently quickly to provide the employment and the innovation that we need? So we've got quite a few issues there, and I really want to start with Francesco, because you used that phrase, Francesco, about being squashed between Silicon Valley and the East, and it's a very good phrase, but it does imply that in a sense we're all in the same boat, that in Italy, in the UK, in France, we're in a sense faced by common problems. Now, of course, as George said, we are faced by the same, many of us are faced by the same kind of Eurozone crisis, even if we're not directly affected, we're indirectly affected in the UK. How valid is it to, in a sense, say, well, we're going to take an EU or a European approach to encouraging innovation, to getting digital education right, to regulating in the right way? Or should we atomize the markets more?
Difficult question. I think there is a common legacy that could be used as a springboard or as a main constraint to move to innovation. I think if I think of the drivers, I mean, I always think that if you take the top Fortune 500 companies in the US, they tend to rotate every 15 to 20 years. They're never the same. So you've got this culture of innovation and change, something that is in the cards, is in the DNA of a certain culture, a certain market. If I then look to China, they have this enormous strength that is the eager, their drive, the hunger to succeed and build an infrastructure. And my concern is that in Europe we're neither. And therefore there is some value in having a European vision. And actually, if you look some of the Lisbon 2001 and 2011 documents, they contain very valuable, very inspiring principles of using this, for instance, digital technology as an opportunity for personal individual inclusion and development. These are values that I think are very important values. But that's where I come, how do you translate this blah, blah, blah into the harsh reality of market dynamics? And I take somehow of a different view vis-a-vis regulation. I think it's how you shape regulation. I think regulation is essential to define a market, but it's how you shape it and where you tilt the balance. You were mentioning about e-money and e-payments. I've seen some action in Italy of the Association of Banking, once again the incumbents, going into bizarre justification of why this can be done and this cannot be done. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the issue of printing e-money is very sensitive and needs to be regulated. But you can't help thinking that very often these guys shape the thought process in a way that the new guys can come in. And what George was saying about Estonia is, incidentally, a country that had relatively little incumbency to protect. And this, I think, is the issue. Is heritage of Europe an opportunity to drive innovation, or is going to be the deadlock whereby big corporations and big incumbencies shape the way in which regulatory and policies are made to the point of potentially driving innovation out of the continent? And I think, I have evidence of both things happening. And my concern is that at this time of crisis, we might tilt the balance toward the past. It's not easy. I mean, to my own country, one of the structural reforms that we're very thankful to the new government to have passed is the reform of pensions. By forcing people to work longer. Right, that's all very good. We've got 31% youth unemployment. And the longer you keep people in business, how do you solve the equation if you don't create an environment when youngsters can create jobs by launching new ventures that potentially compete against the companies that employ people that need to be staying pension, in work? And I think either you have a vision, a fundamental belief that innovation will actually drive wealth for the community, or I'm afraid you are tempted to go back and protect the past.
And do you get a sense that that vision is not there, or do you think it is emerging? I mean, are you an optimist or a pessimist in that respect?
I'm neither at the moment. I see both trends. I think we're on the cusp. I think the demographics could help create push to that happen, but I don't think we're out of the risk of reverting to a bit of myopic protectionism.
And George, I mean, you talked about the SMEs. How, if we were going to stimulate precisely the kind of overarching vision, but without too much regulation, how could we stimulate that? Do we do that by encouraging a kind of bottom-up approach to this? Or is there a role for individual member state governments? Or indeed is the Innovation Union program that you mentioned earlier, is that the instrument that you would choose to get this kind of vision on the road?
Well, I think that's what the European Union is struggling with at the present moment, because, as Francesco says, there are barriers to entries being put up by those who have a vested interest in staying the way it is. Yes. Silicon Valley in America and all that has come out of that had to do with a sort of free flow of ideas and lots of money. One of the great Keynesian presidents of the United States of America was not Bill Clinton, it was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was confronted by a serious recession bordering on a depression in the United States, and by pumping money into defense and hence into Silicon Valley, the economy was sufficiently stimulated in order to produce a huge raft of new companies, new ideas, and the economy growing upwards. So when you look at the defense sector, the rationalization that took place in America and is now taking place in Europe, in itself can sometimes be a barrier to that innovation that is there. But, microwaves, the internet itself, Teflon coating, all of that came out of military expenditure. And there is still a lot of that being driven at the present moment today. And we need to find ways in which the public and the private sector can work in sync to take advantage of all of these new developments that are taking place. You know, some of them are almost science fiction. But when we look at our mobile phone today, I noticed the program here has got BlackBerry breaks. You know, this is a whole new concept. You know, so it used to be T, then it became networking. Now it's an opportunity to go and peer into little tiny screens with the computing power of what used to be IBM mainframe computers in your average mobile phone today. So the science fiction that we see becomes the reality of tomorrow, but only if there are open markets and a degree and a framework. You know, we talk about regulation, but at least a framework that allows that innovation to flower and to stimulate the rest of the economy.
You've been an elected politician, and I was extremely interested to hear what Patrick said about there may be too much consumer protection involved in regulation. So, in a sense, what Patrick is saying is this goes far beyond just creating if you like, a beneficent framework for innovation. This really gets to the detail, which may kill innovation. I mean, how can a politician, in a sense, justify that in those circumstances?
Well, this comes back to political leadership. We heard the Minister for Trade last night speaking at the pre-conference dinner and making the point that we in this country have got one of the most open markets. You know, the companies that have come in, that have taken over, have been welcomed rather than pushed aside. And that's given us, you know, a reputation for being one of the best countries in Europe for foreign direct investment. And sometimes you've got to take the gamble. You know, I had to take decisions as Defence Secretary that were actually very uncomfortable. I had to take a decision about the manufacture of ammunition for the Ministry of Defence that was based both on quality and on price, and that drove us to choose a South African supplier for the ammunition that we were using. And that had the consequence of closing down a factory actually quite close to my constituency. I got a lot of trouble, a lot of grief for it, but I had a responsibility for taxpayers' money and a responsibility to the armed forces for the quality of the product that we were buying. So sometimes political courage has to take place. And we're seeing it, your own coalition. I'm not part of the coalition. I'm not in sympathy with a lot that it's doing, but it's decided that it's going to build a high-speed rail link between London and Birmingham, partly in order to get over the problems of our overcrowded airports in the southeast of England, which have caused so much chaos in the last few days. The line drives through a whole series of Conservative constituencies, but the government has sort of said, we've got to look to the future. We have got to make sure the infrastructure is there, and that degree of political courage will be required, not just here in Italy, where you've got a technocratic government in place, and I think Mario Monti is just the guy to be able to give a bigger vision that will drive some changes. And in the European Union, they've got to have that vision in order to make sure that some of the tough short-term decisions can be taken in order to protect the long-term.
Thank you. Now, Patrick, you said that there was a big divergence now between the way online and offline was treated. And I must say, I think there are many people who would agree with you, but of course, what they wouldn't necessarily agree upon is the fact that the two should be treated the same. You look at the debate about file sharing and so on across the internet. There are many, many debates about the internet and how and whether that should be regulated in the same way that broadcast television is regulated. We're trying to, in a sense, inculcate in a sense of innovation, a sense of valuing technology, both in terms of content and in terms of the devices that can deliver that content. How, if we don't really have any real agreement in this area in terms of copyright, in terms of treatment of creators and so on and so forth. How are we going to get a sort of a culture that we can really use and build on?
That's a very extremely difficult discussion, of course, because when we are talking...
That's what professors are here for.
Yes, exactly. It's a difficult discussion because when talking about internet, social media, we are immediately talking about cross-border activities. And it's already nice that we have something like the European Union, but immediately, again, talking about the internet, it doesn't mean anything, because any kind of content sharing, any kind of service provision through the internet is, whether you receive it from a service provider from Estonia or from the Philippines, it doesn't matter anymore for the end user. So this discussion immediately needs to be done on a global level, and that's a very difficult exercise. And we have seen that, for example, with ACTA, that has just been approved by or signed by the European Commission, is now going through a parliamentary discussion, which is the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, where a few countries, they agreed that it is a good idea to together combat counterfeit materials that are being distributed online. But what do you see there immediately? Well, it's just a few countries. And the internet doesn't make that distinction between you're part of it and you're not part of it. And on the other hand, you do see that as governments more and more starting to discover the internet, that they're trying to introduce some of these offline paradigms to the online world. And a very good example of that is that initiative taken a few weeks ago by the American authorities, the so-called SOPA initiative and PIPA initiative, the Stop Online Piracy Act. And actually, if you look at it, it doesn't matter what it is about, but it is a country that is at this very moment trying to introduce custom controls on the internet. And that's completely new to the technology sector, to the internet world, that is now for 20, 25 years now very active on the internet, and never having been confronted with those with custom controls on the internet. And that is going to be the discussion for the next 5 to 10 years for sure. How can we make legislation that is immediately applicable on a cross-border level? And that's, of course, a difficult issue.
And we've seen US reaction, obviously, and the activity in Congress and so on. But do you see any demonstration of, I mean, George has been very positive about the need for leadership. Do you see any leadership on this coming through in the European Union?
Certainly, we have leadership from two very strong ladies, Mrs. Reding and Mrs. Cruz, and they do take the lead, and they make sure that the European values, that they are being translated into European laws and regulations. But the only thing is to what extent these European values can be extraterritorialized and can be exported to other countries. Because we in Europe, we can say that, well, those American initiatives on regulating the internet, we maybe do not agree with them, but they do not agree with our initiatives, for example, on data protection.
Yep.
And that's the discussion that's going on.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to throw it open to the audience now. Gentleman in the middle. What I'll do is I'll take a couple probably, just see how they fit, and so we can sort of choose, the members of the panel can choose which question they would like to answer. We don't give politicians that right, but we will with our panel this time.
David Lennon from Get Abstract. Yeah, a simple question actually, one you won't like, but I mean, frankly, how do we actually regulate the unregulatable? Because the horse has already bolted, it really has. I mean, today we saw in the news, if you like, the hotspot of innovation in Belgium 8 months ago. The news only came out today, but 8 months ago.
I couldn't quite hear that. Sorry.
8 months ago, you can hear now, hopefully. Yeah. 8 months ago, a human jawbone was actually created by a 3D printer, and it was implanted 8 months ago, and it's now functioning. And the thing about the 3D technology is it just does not recognize boundaries. I mean, IT drives exponential growth, which means that you're using state-of-the-art tools, develop even better state-of-the-art tools. But the 3D printer is different from anything else in that with a 3D printer, it begets another 3D printer. So basically, if you like, you can print, if you want to destabilize an economy, potentially you can print money. create hyperinflation. So these tools exist now. And my simple question is, how can you possibly control that with regulation? I just don't see it's possible.
Infinite replication, right. Gentleman, I think it's a gentleman at the back, yes? Yeah.
Hello, this is Gian Giulivi from Milan. We just heard some very interesting points about the paradox of regulations. For instance, some regulation that's pretty close to the consumer but ends up being against the consumer, like for instance for privacy, with the cookie legislation, with the opt-in, whereby everybody is going to opt in and be, at the end of the day, subject to more invasive measures, because actually it's going to accept all terms and conditions automatically, because this is how internet works. And drawing from this example, I thought it was very interesting the experience of Francesco Ko as advisor to 2 different governments. And as I know from the Italian experience, Francesco Ko made a very interesting work on promoting broadband in Italy, which at the end of the day, actually, it was said that this is very, very interesting, but we don't have enough money. So this is the question, how, if you were, this is for Francesco, but it's also for all the others. For Francesco, if you were an advisor for a 3rd government now, what would you do? Which measure would you first do in the first place in order to convince that actually technology brings wealth? And what would be that measure that can be done without investing a lot of money? Because that's a problem for every government. Thanks.
He'll be advising more than a 3rd government if he gets the answer to that right, I must say. A 3rd question. Have we got a 3rd one? Yeah.
Yes, John Bullard from Identris. Perhaps it's an appropriate question for a law firm, but it seems to me that in putting back, saying less and less nation-state regulation, more and more emphasis should go on to the power of the law of contract between 2 parties, and therefore the more detailed that contract is between 2 trading parties, the less need you actually need for governmental interference, whether it's in the Philippines or whether it's in Europe or anywhere else. And I'd be just interested in the role of the law of contract, in your view, going forward.
I think that's a very wonderful view, if I may say so. It shows great confidence in lawyers in drawing up their contracts, and I shall espouse the cause. Thank you.
Will be delivered with the voice.
Well, I think actually the point about measures which would convince a government that technology brings prosperity, but without great government expenditure, I think it's a question for both Francesco and George. It's a tricky one, isn't it? And it's very cultural, and it's in terms of influencing government policy, I suppose, to deregulate at the end of the day, isn't it?
Difficult, as you were saying, Tim. I had the answer, I wouldn't be here. But advising governments for a fee, hopefully. But I go back to this notion that George was talking and articulating about the vision and a belief of what is relevant to drive innovation. You see, the Italian case was an interesting one. Part of the recommendation of the report was not to plow billions for fiber optics, but to allocate something like 500 million to make sure that coverage of mobile data was universal. Because without that universality, the switch off from analog to digital public administration would have been impossible. But what happened is that particularly the incumbents of the telecom network jumped in and said, oh, no, you don't need to spend money, we'll do it, we keep all that. So, and it's the lack of that debate, the lack of vision that drove, again, some stalemate situation. So I think, there are many initiatives that governments could do. I think of one in Italy, for instance, when it comes to university, is how career paths of professors are shaped. How does this relate to innovation? But very simple, because in Italy, the longer you stay, the higher you get paid in university, which is exactly the opposite of what happened in the US. After 30, 35 years, you're kind of age, not of tenure, your salary goes down and you better begin to work in an industry for innovation. And I'm just picking one of the many things that they could do. They're anchored to a political view, to a vision of what the future should be, and it comes with the courage of what you think is right. Just one word on some of the other questions, particularly the 3D printing, which I think is going to be increasingly relevant. And again, indicates that these, the difference between the gap between digital and real and analog is blurring away. That I think, however, what you were saying, I take some issue, because I don't think that if we think of a universal, seamless transaction of inherently global IP or internet world, implies that we have to forget the notion of what's right and what's wrong, the issue of crime. I mean, if we are building a new city, as in every city, you have the good areas, the bad areas, some signpost, and some policemen policing the society. I don't have the answer in terms of what are the right or wrong values to shape that, but I think the policy makers should have a debate. Internet is not something like, somewhere there. It's here, it's us. Is society, is youth, is age, is health, is everything. And the notion that because it's global and because it's difficult to pinpoint, it is impossible to regulate, I think is flawed. Is one of the key challenges of leadership, where I think Europe, for their inherent international setup, ought to have a fantastic role to play, is a clever democratic debate on what thing or how you should do, how we protect our youngsters as they travel the streets of the digital world. How do we protect intellectual property rights? 3D, think of, we've now been used to copies of songs. Think of the Barbies that we'll be able to print in our rooms. How do you put the Lego? How do you protect that kind of thing? There will have to be some protection. I think it will have to come not with the idea that the price structure of the current incumbents needs to be protected, because it can only drive piracy through that, but through a mutual adjustment to this new world.
Thank you. And George, if you were an advisor to a government, would you have similar thought processes to Francesco? I rather liked Francesco's phrase, a clever democratic debate. Do you think that's what's needed?
Well, I think the first rule of politics is be clever. The second one is you usually ignore the first lesson. But that simply means that you try to get ahead of the game. And it applies in every profession. It applies
Absolutely.
to everyone in here.
Entirely.
You've got to stay ahead of the game. You can't stand still. And those countries, industries, companies who try to sort of atrophy the system, surround it or themselves with regulations, end up being outflanked.
Yep.
You can't possibly do that, and therefore you've got to innovate, you've got to move forward, especially when you've got countries like China and India and Brazil just driving ahead. I was in Brazil in my capacity on the board of the WEIR group in Chile and in Brazil, and you can tangibly feel the energy that is there. These are countries 20 years ago that were military dictatorships, where everything was suppressed, and now the innovation is coming out, the energy is coming out. And if Europe and European countries don't learn the lessons, then they will be left behind. So yes, there has to be a debate, because the technology is outflanking all of us. This point about 3D manufacturing is something, again, that it's difficult to get your mind round, but it's happening. The big data, cloud computing, all of these things, were fanciful, but they are there. Yeah. And the policymakers are way behind. And some of the companies seeking to protect themselves are also way behind. Now, in a funny way, in the defense field, you've got to be ahead of the game. Having yesterday's technology is absolutely no use. Because if you haven't spotted what the vulnerabilities are, and what the superiorities are in the other areas, then you're dead, literally, and not just left behind. And that's why the military sphere has always driven innovation. You know, that the technology that led to auto cues on television came from the technology in tanks with on-screen instructions. And now it's in healthcare, it's in face recognition. All of that is coming largely from that SME sector that is involved in defence as well. So if it can be done in defence, it can be done elsewhere as well. But you know, a clever debate is what is required to get the balance between encouraging innovation and at the same time making sure that we don't kill off everything that we've got just now, including the values like privacy and decency, you know, that are actually under challenge at the present moment. And that, for governments, is going to be a very difficult debate to control.
Thank you. And Patrick, finally, what do you think? Are you as optimistic about Francesco as our ability to regulate things like 3D printing and so on? I mean, and how far should we deregulate? Do you think we should just rely on the law of contract?
Well, I think that technology is moving so fast, so swiftly, that's the big frustration of the policymakers, of course, that whatever you do from a legal perspective, from a lawmaking perspective, you're always too late and technology is already 2-3 steps further. So I do believe a lot in what is being called co-regulation, which is that the lawmakers, and more often this is being done, that the lawmakers, they actually set the basic principles. And they do not go into the details. They do not into, for example, what they did with the e-signature directive, requiring 30 different technical requirements in order to have a qualified electronic signature. No, just the basic principles, as you just mentioned, and then mandate the standardization organizations, which actually is the industry, to come up with technical standards that are always voluntary, but if you meet them, if you follow those standards, then you know that you're acting in compliance with the rules, with the legislation. The whole discussion nowadays is going, who should be those standardization bodies? Because we have 3 official formal standardization organizations like CEN, like ETSI, and that's of course out of date, because also the industrial fora, the consortia, they should also have their say and be able to draft standards that would be that counterpart of the basic principles of those European directives and regulations. So co-regulation, I think, could be an answer for that fast-moving technology evolution.
Patrick, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we've got time for. But I think you'll agree that I think George used the phrase that we've got to be ahead of the game. Well, our 3 panelists have really helped us think ahead of the game, and I think that's been a great session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.